All right, so we're going to try this out. I'm going to do kind of a, my thoughts on the case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is a book by H.P. Lovecraft. That first book I read this year. It's my second time delving into H.P. Lovecraft. The first time was a book called Mountains of Madness, which I picked up because I had been playing this board game that my friend Ben got me into. That's called At the Mountains of Madness. Board game's really cool if you want to try it out. But the book itself, because I liked the board game so much, I tried out the book, and the book was like the weirdest thing that I've ever read. I've never read Lovecraft before. I've never really been into horror, and it was just, first of all, the type of writing that this author does is very dense. It's not easy to read. It doesn't have kind of a smooth writing style. It is heavy on vocabulary. It is it's basically literature the way the guy writes. I mean, he's writing horror, but he writes literature. And what he comes up with is just the story about the Mountains of Madness is, intergalactic flying animal plant hybrid monsters that have come and invaded the world, millions of years ago, before even archaea or, bacteria probably even developed naturally on the earth, before, human evolution, before plant and animal evolution, really. It's what it seemed like to me. And, it's this ancient species that has come in uh, and developed itself and then gone into hiding for millions and millions and millions of years, and then they're like resurfacing. That's a really horrible retelling of what At the Mountains of Madness is. It's been a while. It's also a really weird book. Anyway, this book is also a horror story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. And it's strange to me to think of it. It's called The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. If this was written today, it would be The Curious Case of Charles Dexter Ward, or The Strange Case, or The Uncanny Case, or, they'd put some type of adjective onto it. I guess it's, old school horror, old school titles. They didn't need to put, some cool adjective in the front of it. Anyway, it's a much more classic type of horror story. It deals with kind of like black magic, voodoo magic. Um, the basic plot, if you could say anything about how Lovecraft writes, is basic. Is you have this young character who becomes very obsessed with his lineage and filling in his own family tree, and as he's kind of researching into his past, into his family's past, he discovers this character, Joseph Kerwin, I think was the guy's name. It's been like a couple weeks since I read this, who apparently was a very strange character. I mean, by the time he was 50, he still looked like he was in his 30s, and then he lived for another 50 or 60 or 70 years, and he never really looked like he aged. So he was doing some type of weird voodoo magic there, and he had done all sorts of strange things. This character of Joseph Kerwin, he had kind of built his own farm out in the boondocks, like out in the catacombs, and he had had these constant shipments of meat going into his into his farmland, and he had all of these slaves that he had on his farm, because it was in the 1700s he had slaves, and people like never really knew exactly what was going on with his slaves on his his farmland, on his property, because it seemed like there was something up with them that was strange. And he had built these tunnel systems and these catacombs underneath his farm, and people would always hear these screaming and these gurgling and these strange spooky horror sounds that you would expect from any B-rate horror movie in the 1980s or something like that. So anyway, circumstances arise that end up killing Joseph Kerwin, but the story isn't about him anyway. It's about Charles Dexter in the present and him discovering this ancient black voodoo magic ancestor of his. And he gets obsessed with this ancestor, obsessed to the point that he you know, he takes this long trip in Europe for like 2 or 3 years when he's 20, and he drops out of college just so he can go and find letters and some type of evidence and information about this character. And when he comes back, he's even, more obsessed than ever before, and he starts developing at a certain point in the story. It seems like he's invoking his ancestor. I mean, his personality seems to be the same. He even like as he grows up looks more and more and more like this ancestor of his. And so it gets really spooky. Well, it doesn't get really spooky. The whole story is really spooky. Without giving the whole story away, that's kind of how the plot progresses. And then from there, it takes a number of different turns. He is a dense writer. He doesn't write easy to read stories. I think I've never been a big horror reader, and so when I think of horror, I think of kind of like popcorn fiction. I think of 1980s movies. I think of Stranger Things. I think of Freddy the 13th or whatever it is, Friday the 13th. Stupid Freddy the 13th. Anyway, I think of that kind of stuff, and so when I'm reading H.P. Lovecraft stuff, he reminds me of like Charlotte Bronte or something like that. He's always flexing his. That's probably a horrible comparison for anybody who's really into literature. But what I mean by that is he is constantly flexing his vocabulary skills. He's constantly, telling the story in the most economic way in terms of word count, but also not spoon-feeding you plot or spoon-feeding you the story, not spoon-feeding you the images. He's really good that way as an author in so far as his ability to show you what's going on through a really obscure lens, telling you what's happening without just telling you exactly what's going on. There's, for example, these creatures that at one point you find that are stuck in these grates in the ground. They're deep inside of a tunnel, and in that tunnel there's these kind of like wells that are carved out into the ground, and down inside those wells are these creatures. And the creatures aren't ever described in great detail. He kind of like beats around the bush in his descriptions. And I think that's great, because what it forces you to do as a reader is kind of fill in the blanks, figure out what does that thing look like for you. There's so many times where he'll, instead of telling you what the incantation is that this guy uses when he does black magic, or describe the exact things that happen when something spooky or creepy is going on, he'll just kind of tell you sounds that people heard, or he'll say that a character walked into a room and saw something that was so horrific that they'll never be the same afterwards. In his way, he's able to make the story even creepier and even scarier and even spookier, because he doesn't tell you exactly what's going on. So some of the funny things that kind of happen in the book are like, it's because it's written so far long ago. There are certain terms that you hear nowadays that are different from what they used back when he was writing. Like, for example, both at the Mountains of Madness, when I read that, as well as this one, whenever somebody pulled out a flashlight, it's not a flashlight, it's a hand torch or something like that. And no, an electric torch. They call it an electric torch. And anytime there's like a psychiatrist, the main character, basically, not Charles Dexter Ward, but the perspective that we see Charles Dexter Ward through, the character that we kind of follow, is his psychiatrist. And he's not called a psychiatrist, he's called an alienist. And so I'm like, 10, 20 pages into this book, and they keep saying the alienists, the alienist. The alienist didn't think that he was crazy yet. The alienist thought this about Charles. I'm like, what, the alienists? And so I was expecting something kind of like Mountains of Madness, where some, crazy alien was gonna, be built into the story somehow. And no, an alienist is a psychiatrist, apparently. As far as like how much I enjoyed the book, I wrote a review of it on Goodreads, and I gave it 3 stars. 3 stars for me, it was, I totally was engaged the whole way through. There was nothing really that I think is negative about the book. I don't like to give like a critique. I'm not a book I'm not a literary critic or anything like that, so I don't want to. There's nothing in it that I particularly disliked. It was hard for me a little bit to get through because the language is just so dense and intense, and it's above a fifth grade reading level. It's not like reading. I feel like most books that are written nowadays, the reading level as far as the expected vocabulary of the reader is much lower, and in a lot of ways it makes books more accessible, but it also makes for you know I don't know, maybe a reading class that doesn't have as high a vocabulary. I'm definitely as guilty as that as anybody of not having a higher active and functioning vocabulary. But in any case, that was one thing that was just kind of a little bit hard to get through for this book. It's not a long book. Apparently, it's one of, if not his longest book, it's one of H.P. Lovecraft's longest book, and it's still only like the version that I have is like 100 pages, 110 pages, something like that. But it's a dense 110 pages because of the way that it's written, and there's so many cases where you're not only reading H.P. Lovecraft's own literary style, but his literary style interpreting the way people wrote letters back in the 1700s, because there's a number of times where you have to read letters from some of the characters from that time, and they write ye's and yours, and I don't know, the way that they write is so awkward for somebody who isn't used to it. And because of that, there's also story elements that they introduce, concepts that I thought I was supposed to understand from the beginning. Like they talk about animal salts. And I'm like, what the heck? The animal salts? What are animal salts? And so it's one of those things where it's written, it's only ever referred to by those people who wrote it in their letters from, centuries before. And so I thought, okay, maybe if I had a stronger working understanding of how people talked back then, I would understand this. But no, it's something that you have to get through to the end of the book, and it gets explained by the end of the book what those animal salts are. And I don't know to what extent I should be spoiling anything on this review that I'm putting out on the internet, so I'm not going to say anything about it. But the very first word in the book is animal salts, and it's like you have no clue what that is. So there's mystery elements to it that I didn't realize were supposed to be mystery elements. So anyway, my final thoughts. I enjoyed the book. I definitely plan on reading some more Lovecraft in the future. He's definitely not my favorite author by any means, because he's he writes horror. I'm not big into horror, but I like to try anything. He has a really dense and kind of difficult writing style, and while I appreciate it, it is a little bit harder for me to get into that. Another book that I'm planning on doing maybe one of these for, we'll see how that goes. I finished Malala. I'm working on 100 Years of Solitude and Catcher in the Rye, which I should have read back when I was in high school, but anyway, we'll see. So if you have read this book and have any insights that you want to share with me, awesome. If you're inspired to read the book, go ahead and check it out. And if there's any thoughts that you had on anything that I said, go ahead and give me some feedback. Hope to see you soon.